So in this video, I'm going to kind of go over a few reasons why a lot of shad move shallow in the fall, but then why some of them don't and how the bass relate to their movements so you can target them effectively. So we're going to talk about the two most common types of shad here just to keep this simple, which is the threadfin shad and the gizzard shad. You can see they are pretty similar looking, but there are a few differences as far as their characteristics go. But first we're going to talk about their diet, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how you can identify what's what and where you might find these. As far as their main food source goes, it is phytoplankton and zooplankton. We'll think as phytoplankton as little plants. They are totally subjective to wind or currents. That is going to determine where they end up on the lake. They have no control of where they are. They just produce oxygen through photosynthesis, so it's really important for the entire lake to have phytoplankton, or there wouldn't be any dissolved oxygen in the water, or very little. And then zooplankton, we will just think of that as small little animals. Just very simply put, organisms. Some of them can technically move, but we're also just going to group it in to that they can't really move, and it's going to be the same thing. Wind currents is going to kind of position them where they're at, just to keep that very simple. These two things could almost be a whole nother video in itself, but we won't get too caught up in those. So one thing to note is your gizzard shad, as they become more mature, they can actually become benthic feeders. So benthic is just a fancy way of saying it is below the area in the water column where kind of light penetrates down, and it's going to just basically be where dead things end up. So fish or plants, things that decay, they fall down to the bottom, and the gizzard shad can actually start to filter them up and kind of eat that. So think of them as like kind of cleaners on the bottom. And it doesn't have to be just on the bottom. They can also kind of come up to bigger rocks or around docks and kind of like suck on the algae or the matter or stuff that's hanging on that. This is important to note just because it can be done in deeper water year round. So there is a reason why the gizzard shad do not have to necessarily move all the way to the back of the creeks, because they have the food source that they need right there. But keep in mind, they do have to be of a certain size in order to do that. They're not necessarily going to be the most juvenile ones that are going to be out there feeding on things on the bottom. As far as your differences between the looks of threadfin and gizzard shad, you'll see they are pretty similar, but the first thing we're going to look at here is kind of the shape of the body leading up to the mouth. So we'll look at the threadfin, and it looks like they just come together. You know, it's pretty symmetrical. It looks like if you just drew a really simple picture of a fish, this is what it's going to look like. Your lines are going to match up. But you go down to your gizzard shad here, and you draw on your lines, and then you get to the nose, and it just turns flat. So the gizzard shad, I like to think, looks like it ran into a wall swimming 20 miles an hour and flattened its nose out, where the threadfin shad kind of has a normal jaw. And then the other big thing to look at is the color of the fins. So you have your dorsal fin on the back here, which is very yellow on your threadfin, and your tail is very yellow, and on your gizzard shad it is black. So that is also another very easy way to tell them apart. They both have a similar dot here back behind the eye, although the gizzard shad is a little bit more faint. And then you can see that the threadfin also has kind of more of a streak of yellow around the edge here. This is kind of what I think like the sexy shad colors resemble a lot, which is popular in a lot of baits, with that bluish white with that kind of yellow stripe, where your gizzard shad has a little bit more of a purplish silver hue. It's a little harder to tell in this picture. Your threadfin shad top out around 6 to 8 inches in length, where your gizzard shad can actually get huge. They can actually get up to like 18 inches. I think the state record in Missouri is like over 2 pounds or something for that, for a gizzard shad somebody gigged. Most of the time the fish, like especially around like the Ozarks, keep them in check. For this specific video, I'm just going to be using Lake the Ozarks as the example, going through some of the stuff on avionics here in a little bit. But the main thing to keep in mind is Lake the Ozarks is primarily gizzard shad. According to the Missouri Department of Conservation, there really are no threadfin shad in Lake the Ozarks. That could be up to debate for some people. I know there is a power plant lake that kind of feeds into Lake the Ozarks via a creek, but I don't think they've found a sustainable population of threadfin shad that end up in Lake the Ozarks, and they're only in the other lake because of the power plant keeping it warm enough for the threadfin shad to live, because they are very susceptible to dying around 45 degrees and less, whereas the gizzard shad seem to be a little bit more hardy, but you're still going to get shad kills when you get into, just say below 45 is when it can start happening, but really around that 40-degree mark is when it becomes the most prominent. So with that, you're going to kind of have a line across the country of where it's going to flip-flop to where you're going to have threadfin and gizzard shad, or you're going to have mostly gizzard shad. And Missouri is right about on that line. So just say Lake the Ozarks doesn't really have a prominent population of it, but if you go just a little bit south of Table Rock, it is primarily threadfin shad. All right, now let's start talking about the actual transition here. So throughout the summer, the shad will be hanging out in the euphotic or limnetic zone, whatever you want to call it. So limnetic is just a fancy word for out in the open water. It could also be a pelagic zone. And then you have the euphotic zone, which is basically just another fancy way of saying how far down the light can penetrate into the water. You're going to have life down in this area basically, because that's where the oxygen is going to be produced. You can kind of also think of this as the thermocline a little bit, just it depends if you have current and things of that nature. But moving on from that, this can be out in the main lake, this could be the guts of the creeks, or even in the backs of the creeks in the shallow, although that's usually going to be at night or the very early morning in the late summer, as the water temperatures are still pretty high. But they're going to be searching for nutrient-rich water. They can be banks being hit by wind because the plankton is going to get stacked up on there, or areas with current, or places with runoff that is putting ample nutrients in the water that's setting it up for a good algae bloom. These are all areas that the shad are going to be looking for to just have an adequate food source. So what actually gets the shad to start moving towards the back of the creeks, and there is a few things. So as summer starts to lead into early fall, a few things are happening that's signaling to the shad that it's time to start moving. The number one factor to me is photoperiod. This is for not just fish, this is for pretty much all animals. The length of daylight is changing. That's always something that can kind of keep them on track, especially when we have crazy weather with cold spells, hot spells, whatever. You would get so off track. But there's always one thing that is consistently changing, either getting shorter or longer, and that is photoperiod in the day. So they can sense it's going to be time to feed heavily before winter. They know that cooler weather's coming. But it's really consistent when you start seeing the shad moving toward the back, no matter the water temperature. So we'll just use this year as an example because the water temperature is 5, 6, maybe 7 degrees warmer than it normally is this time of the year. But you still see shad making their way back. Not in full swing yet, and I think the water temperature has them kind of in limbo just a little bit because we get some cool nights and then we have warm weather back in the 90s again, and the water temperature just won't stay down. But you can definitely tell there's a push of shad moving their way back into the creeks. So the next two big factors are water temperature and then your available nutrients and runoff. So we're at the end of the summer, say the main lake water temperature is still in the 80s. We start to get some cool nights. This water temperature in the back of these creeks, back of these pockets and stuff is going to get a lot cooler, a lot quicker than this main lake water. That's just based on the volume. You have, 3 foot of water back here, or you have 50 foot of water back here. If this starts getting some wind on it too overnight or something, or early in the morning and starts mixing this up a little bit, this is going to get a lot cooler than this really fast. This might get down into the 70s, and the shad may just want to get back to some cooler water and get out of that warmer mid 80 degree water. But as the water starts to cool down a little bit more, this can actually get better during the middle of the day because this water is going to warm up quickly and it's going to produce a little algae bloom for them, where this water out here is going to be a lot cooler and just won't have as good a bloom. So the water temperature kind of goes both ways. Early on, I think it's just a little bit cooler, maybe a little more comfortable. But then as it gets later on and the water temperature starts to decrease, it's better to be near that shallow water or in that shallow water during the midday sun, where it can help warm up real quick. And they can soak up some of that warmer water and get some nutrients out of it before it gets into a little bit more of that late fall, early winter type pattern. And as far as your runoff of nutrients, you get rain, you get fresh water coming in here, you get more oxygen, you get nutrients, things set up kind of for the last warm days of the year to help get some better algae blooms in there. So that's a big reason why a lot of the shad move back, is because they're trying to soak up the last of the nutrients, last of the food for the year, kind of get as much as they can before winter comes. Now, with that being said, with all the shad that move to the back of the creeks and in these pockets and stuff like that, you're also going to find that some will never leave the main lake. And this is especially true, like I was talking about earlier, for some of those bigger gizzard shad, because they can feed off of riprap, chunk rock, bluff walls around docks, and there's no reason for them to move all the way to the back of the creeks. It's going to be the same thing as the bass. If they have everything they need, if they have oxygen and food, there's no reason for them to move a long distance. One thing you'll notice is the various sizes of shad. You're going to have some that will be very small, as they were the last of the shad to spawn. Others will be pretty big, sometimes around 6 or more inches. But they are almost always grouped up with the same class of fish. You usually won't find like the 2-inch shad mixed up with the 6-inch shad. It's gonna be like a group of 2 and 3-inch shad, and then maybe a group of like 5 and 6-inch, or so on and so forth. If you can find the good groups of like the bigger 5, 6-inch shad, to me, that means I'm in a good area to be around some big fish. All right, so we'll talk about how this ties into the bass movement. We'll kind of use some examples here on avionics, but first we'll talk about how the fall is a little bit different than spring, because there is no biological reason really for the fish to go shallow other than chasing a food source. And if their food source doesn't move, well, then they're not going to move. So you got to think about, in the spring, the fish, they want to spawn. They're going to push shallow. Now, how clear the water is determines how shallow they actually have to go to spawn, but there's a push, or there's a reason for them to move up to the bank. We'll just use this kind of as an example. Say in the springtime, the fish are kind of relating to this deeper ledge where they could maybe slide up behind some of these docks and spawn and stuff, but a lot of them are probably going to work their way back and at least some of these little pockets and stuff to spawn into, if not further back. But in the fall, you know, if the food stays here on this ledge and say that's where they're at or on this point, the bass aren't going to leave. There's no reason for them to have to go anywhere to do anything. They're just eating up, getting ready for the winter. So as long as there's adequate food there, that's where they're pretty much going to stay. Now, with that being said, a good amount of fish will migrate to the backs of the creeks that will follow the shad. We'll just say there's been some fish on the main lake, and not to say that these fish are going to just go cruising all the way to the back of the flats here. They may go through and stop at some stuff. They may only go back to one of these smaller pockets. Here on Lake the Ozarks, I know there is a good population of what I call resident fish. Some of these fish, after the spawn, they never left. They may have never left this little cove. They may have never left the couple docks they were around that could have been in and out of brush, or they could have just been on the kind of the same stretch of bank, or they could have slid out to some secondary points. You know, it's hard telling. We would never really know unless like we caught fish and tagged them. And that may sound kind of silly, but that just means to me basically a fish may move into an area for a spawn and they never left. There may be a fish that started in this creek right here and they don't even know that there's the rest of this lake. To them, this creek is all that they know, or maybe only part of it is all that they know. There's no reason for them to ever leave this area. They have everything they need, so why would they venture out? But these fish that do stay in these areas, we'll just kind of pick on this little spot here as a target. But say we had some fish in here and they've been sitting around these docks or sitting on some brush piles on this little bit steeper bank or something. These fish, to me, are primarily feeding on bluegill throughout the summer, especially the ones on the docks. Every summer, every full moon, you get a bluegill spawn. You go around pretty much any shallower dock, and it's going to be just covered in bluegill, from small fingerlings to bluegill, you know, size of your hand or bigger. The fish that hang around these areas have everything they need. No reason for them to leave, so they're just going to hang out and keep eating bluegill. Now, as the shad start to migrate, say they're pushing through the gut of the creek, following this creek channel or something, some may branch out in here. Now these bass are sitting on these shallower docks, and you got shad starting to push their way in here. Well, now they're just sitting here on a buffet line, so they're just going to sit around any sort of cover. It can be shallower cover, like way in the back. It could be docks like this. It could be laydowns. It could be closer to deep water. There's really not a right or a wrong place for them to sit. They're just going to be opportunistic feeders. So that's just kind of another way to look at the whole migration aspect of bass. Now, for the fish that are moving towards the back, it's going to be the same thing as the springtime. They're going to stop on channel banks, secondary points. I like to look for a little bit of flatter ones in the fall. Brush piles, abnormal docks, basically anything that is different or has changed, breaks up the monotony of a bank. And as it gets a little bit cooler, you can kind of start working your way back further and further and further, and then you might find them out on the flats, especially when the shad are totally out there. But sometimes they can be a little bit harder to catch like that. You can just fan cast around the schools of the shad. I seem to do a little bit better stopping at targets nearby the flats. It seems like the fish hang out on like a solid object. And then as the water cools back down, say we're getting into early winter, late fall, the water's getting back down into the mid 50s, you know, it's below 60 again. Working our way into that early winter pattern as far as the fish that are going to migrate back out and kind of follow the shads out into the guts of the creeks a little bit, or as the shad make their way, some of them back out to the deeper points, or some maybe out to the main lake again. You're just going to follow the same things back out. But I do like to focus on a bigger chunk rock points or banks as you're kind of getting in that cooler water and getting into the late fall, early winter. Last but not least, we'll talk about baits. So fall is a time of true junk fishing. I don't know if there's really a wrong or right bait to throw in the fall. You can talk to 30 people in the fall and you could have them throwing all different things and probably all catch fish. So what it comes down to is throw what you're most comfortable and confident with, and then cover a lot of water, especially as it starts to get a little bit cooler, because you don't want to beat one bank or one area to death and be like, man, I've tried 3 or 4 different things and I'm just not getting bit. You need to haul out of there and try something else, try a different area, try some different baits, and just keep your bait wet. But a lot of times in the fall, you might pick up 1 or 2 fish on a buzz bait around Chunk Rock Bank. Then you might catch one skipping a jig around a dock. Then you might go all the way to the back of a creek and throw a whopper plopper or square bill or spinnerbait and catch some. So it's just kind of all over the place. It seems like it's like run and gun style. I actually really like fishing in the fall because you can just kind of just go crazy and see what you can put together in a day. And you don't get super dialed in always on like one thing to do. You just kind of got to mix it up, keep your options open. But on Lake the Ozarks, I really like to throw jigs, your shaky head worms, creature baits like your Zoom brush hog. I still usually dye the tails, a little bit chartreuse. Still kind of mostly imitating that bluegill. Spinner baits, you can throw a square bill or a lipless, basically in a lot of the same spots I would throw a spinnerbait. As the water does get a little bit cooler, even maybe just below 70, I really start to like throwing buzz bait, whopper plopper, and a jerk bait. And then once the water gets below about 60 degrees, then I can start breaking out the A-rig a little bit, and I start to have more confidence in that. And then for some areas, there's a million boat docks on Lake the Ozarks, so I like to target both your shallow and your deep docks, but I'm still mostly focusing behind it, so that's the side closer to the bank. So I may go to the back of the creeks and flip the shallower docks, but there's going to be 8 million people trying to do the same thing. So sometimes you mix it up and go to a little bit deeper docks, or see if you can find like a certain area in the creek halfway back, 3/4, whatever, maybe on a secondary point or kind of a specific type of rock. Kind of pay attention to where that is, and sometimes you can recreate that. I like to look for the big gizzard shad, and then I throw big spinner baits, top water, crankbaits, sometimes even a jerk bait around them. But I oftentimes find that, like I said earlier, around the bigger chunk rock, bluff walls. For some reason, I like the whopper plopper in the fall. It just seems to do pretty dang good for me usually. And then as the water temperature continues to cool off, like I said, you get down below that 60-degree mark. Then your A-rig, spinner bait, I'll throw some top water, and then the jig and jerk bait kind of become my staple of baits that I'm really going to focus on. But just remember, their primary food source cannot move, directed either by current or wind. So if you get a nice windy day with wind blowing like all the way up a creek, all the way down the length, all the way to the back of the flat, that can be a really fun time to get back on some active fish. But hopefully this helped you understand shad a little bit more, and then will help you get a little bit better of a fall pattern going, or a fall bite, or just when you're running and gunning, figure out what you're trying to do, where you're going. You can kind of maybe think back on some of the points of this video and help you catch some more fish. So thanks for watching, guys. We'll have some more videos out, and good luck out on the water.